Okay, we're recording on May 14th, 2015. We're talking with Neil Nelkin, who is a longtime Nebraska broadcaster, and this is part of the Nebraska Broadcasting History Project. Neil, welcome to the project, and to start out with, please spell your name so the transcript has it correct.
Neil, N-E-I-L, Nelkin, N-E-L-K-I-N.
Okay, thank you. Now tell us a little bit about how you got into broadcasting and what your early history is before you got to some of the more recent things.
I was one of those kids that grew up listening to radio on a transistor back in the day. I remember, particularly before I knew what it was, nighttime skywave making distant radio stations available across the country. I remember listening to WLW in Cincinnati, KOMA in Oklahoma City on 1520, and sometimes WKBW in Buffalo on 1520, depending upon weather and skywave conditions at night.
Where were you at this time?
I was in New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island various times, but immediately fell in love with this distant technology that brought in voices and music from all over the country. I just thought it was the most fascinating, interesting, exciting thing there was. And then once I got into college, started working part-time at radio stations and seeing it from the inside, which was more exciting than actually listening to it, and just built a relationship with radio from there.
Where was the college and where were the stations?
The college was, at the time, Bryant College in Providence, Rhode Island. It is now Bryant University in Smithfield, Rhode Island. After I left, they became a university. The radio station, the first radio station, was a little traditional, as everybody says, an AM daytimer at 1590, still there, WARV. It was the second radio station owned by a bunch of guys from college who built a chain called Sconix Radio back in the 60s and 70s. Scott Nixon, Randy O'Neill. This was their second radio station. I believe they were from Cornell, and they had a station up there. So this was their second station, a daytime AM, and then various other radio stations in and around the Providence market. And then summers, I worked at ABC Television in New York City in broadcast operations and engineering, which gave me a backdoor look into network television and got to do a lot of work around the network in various places once I got my union card so I could touch the equipment.
How do you compare your interest in radio versus your interest in television?
Radio was always more interesting to me because one person could do what you wanted to do and have the effect on the total outcome. Where television, you're always dependent upon other people. Sometimes I was one of the people that was depended upon. If you were running a camera, one of 3 or 4 in a studio, the talent had no control over how they looked. The guys on the camera did, the guys in the control room did. In radio, you had control over everything you did, and I liked that.
How'd you get to Nebraska?
I was in Denver at the time. This would have been late 60s, early 70s. I was in Denver, working part-time, various radio stations here and there, trying to get a full-time gig. And an opportunity opened up in North Platte for an afternoon show program director situation. I went out and applied, and they hired me for $500 a month.
Who was the person who hired you?
Dick Wagner, who was a station owner. He owned the station along with a group of guys from Lincoln, and Dick was a former manager for Dick Chapin at the Stewart stations, had gone on to get into professional baseball. At the time, he was the general manager and vice president for the Cincinnati Reds during their big run in the 70s.
What was the call letters of the station?
Call letter station, KODY, then and now, 1240 AM. It was a standalone AM station, as most were back then. Dick had gone through a series of managers at the station. It was kind of a revolving door, as a lot of small markets were back then. But Dick Wagner was in, probably twice a month from Cincinnati to oversee the operation.
What was the year approximately?
71 maybe, 72, in that neighborhood.
How long did you stay in North Platte?
I stayed in North Platte in various ways, means. We thought it would be a good opportunity we meaning myself, a couple of other guys, to try to build our own radio station. At the time, there were 2 FM stations in North Platte. There was an application filed for a third, and we filed against the applicant, we meaning myself and Chuck Swartz and a couple of other guys and a local beer distributor who backed us financially, and applied for and received the authorization for 103.5 FM, put it on the air in 1982, KXNP.
And how long did you stay in North Platte?
Till about 1986, I was hired by Ray Lockhart to come to Ogallala, where he had an AM/FM operation and also had AM/FMs in Burlington, Colorado, and had just purchased Sterling, Colorado, and was looking for somebody to be a group program director, and I came on board with Ray as group program director in Ogallala.
Ray is, of course, a legendary person in Nebraska broadcasting. Talk a little bit about your experience working at KOGA.
KOGA was a really unique operation. Ray's son, Kevin, had just come out of the Air Force at that time, and it was a pretty evolutionary time in radio where computers were just starting to become a part of the structure of radio stations. Kevin, Ray's son, was a computer expert and developed the software that was originally called Audio Prophet, and with Ray's backing, ended up developing what is today, under the name NextGen, the same system that is today the dominant radio software operating system. That was done in Ogallala. In fact, they're still headquartered in Ogallala.
How long did you stay with that
About
company?
a year. About a year.
What was the next step?
Next step was Lincoln at KLIN with Norton Warner. Came on board essentially as a promotions manager for KLIN, and over the next few years developed an on-air presence, a sales presence, and eventually became station manager under Norton Warner.
How long did you stay in Lincoln?
I stayed in Lincoln until 1993. At the time, KFOR was the local affiliate for Nebraska football, the network. You may remember at the time there were 4 radio networks that carried Nebraska football, 2 in Omaha, 2 in Lincoln. And then the Board of Regents awarded a sole contract to KFAB to be the sole originator for Nebraska football. KFOR was the Lincoln affiliate for the KFAB network. And we wanted, obviously, to become the Lincoln affiliate. And we worked diligently, and I determined I would stay there and do everything I could to help get the affiliation away from KFOR to KLIN. Once that happened, Marty Riemenschneider came down to Lincoln and asked me to come to Omaha and to go to work with him and John Mitchell at what was then 1180 KKAR.
How long were you active in radio in Omaha?
I started in Omaha July 3rd, 1993, and just recently left January 31st, 2015.
Now, you've had an interesting perspective on radio, but also the Nebraska Broadcasters Association. What do you recall about the Nebraska Broadcasters Association over the years?
Well, my first experience with the Broadcast Association was when Ray Lockhart coerced me into becoming a board member while I was still in North Platte. And we served on the board together, Ray and I and you and Ken Fierno, Larry Rice. It was a very interesting board. We did a lot of great things, and I became very much interested in the association back then. And I think we accomplished a lot in the few years that we worked together.
What do you remember about the conventions and those
Made
fair
money.
things? Okay.
Conventions, the NBA conventions traditionally were an expense, not a revenue source. And one of the highlights was during those years, we actually were not an expense, we actually generated revenue.
Now, as I understand it, you were the convention chair. When were you a convention chair?
I honestly don't remember what year it was, but I was convention chair the year the convention was held in North Platte, which I would guess maybe 73, 74, maybe 75, I'm not sure.
Probably not 74, but probably
Okay.
later than that.
Maybe a little later, I don't really remember.
Okay. What else do you remember about the association?
The fact that there were some tremendous broadcasters in Nebraska who were very active and very aggressive in the association. One of the reasons I became a fan of the association was the guys that I worked with at KODY, particularly Joe DiNatale, who was the former president of the association, legendary Nebraska broadcaster. He was a big supporter of the association, and one of the fundamental reasons that I became a supporter as well.
When you were in North Platte, as compared to Lincoln and to Omaha, what's the perception of the audience for radio in those days, North Platte versus Lincoln versus Omaha, the listeners?
I think in those days, the smaller the market, the more involved in the community radio stations were. We covered every city council meeting. We covered every school board meeting. We covered every county board meeting. We were much more involved and knew everybody who was of importance in the community. And I think the radio station managers, owners, and employees were also pretty well known in the community as representatives of the people at these various meetings. I don't think that is done quite as much anymore, maybe still in small markets, but you don't see it in Lincoln and Omaha the way we used to see it back then.
In a town like North Platte, what's the role of the radio station in terms of the glue of the community?
To highlight what's important in the community, to bring out the best in the community, to maybe remonstrate against things that may not be of the best all the time. For instance, a particular incident I remember in North Platte, the night of the murders of the Henry Kelly family in Sutherland, which was just to the west of North Platte. It was a pretty horrific night of events. We, at the time, took whatever equipment we had and had people on scene in Sutherland, particularly at the Kelly home, reporting on the events of the night, not knowing that our guy, Mark Richardson, who is now deceased, Mark Richardson was doing live reports from in front of the Kelly home, live interviews with the sheriff at the time, Hop Gilster, not knowing that the suspect, Charles Orwin Simance, was less than 25 feet away, hiding under the porch at the Kelly home while we were doing those live interviews. We found out about it the next morning after he was captured. Things like that, bringing those things to the community. I remember that night that we didn't know what was going on, and the people in Sutherland, the people in North Platte didn't know. Law enforcement had put out alerts, stay in your homes, lock your doors and windows. We don't know what we have. We don't know if it's this one person who is the suspect. It could be multiple suspects. And until the next day, we didn't know. And then, as you know, the subsequent trial became national news with a lot of the legal proceedings that went on with regard to prior restraint of news media in covering the charges that were brought in those trials.
Now, over the years, you had the opportunity, as you mentioned, to deal with sports broadcasting. Talk a little bit about the interest in sports broadcasting in Nebraska.
In a small market, sports broadcasting is so critically important. You carry a lot of live sports events in markets like North Platte and in Lincoln especially, where people want to hear their teams on the radio, the high school teams. They want to follow the basketball program, the football program. They want to hear the interviews with the coaches. They want to hear their kids' voices and names on the radio. So it became a very important part of the programming mix and also an important part of the sales operation, selling live local sports coverage. That became an important part of the revenue of most smaller radio stations. I remember when I went to Lincoln and we were doing high school games in Lincoln, the play-by-play team at KLIN was Jim Rose and Adrian Fiala on our high school football and basketball, both of whom have gone on to greater things since those days. But that was the fun of doing high school sports with Jim Rose and Adrian Fiala at KLIN in Lincoln.
Now, your career also has bridged the prominence of FM in comparison to AM. Talk about programming, audience interest, technology, as you've experienced the transition from AM to FM.
I think early on, FM was, nobody knew what to do with it early on. It was either a simulcast situation or they just put beautiful music on it simply to keep the signal on so that they could keep the license. Early on, there were even a number of operators that turned their FM licenses back into the commission because they didn't know what to do with them and they were not in any way financially successful. I guess it was during the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, FM became something of its own, mainly with album rock formats. But in smaller markets, the expense of putting FM on the air was not really something that everybody thought was justified. We did it in 1982, and we were the third FM station in North Platte. There were FM stations that went on in Grand Island, standalone FM stations. In the late 60s, early 70s, they started to proliferate across the state. Lincoln, of course, had them. Omaha had FMs. But they targeted different audiences. At the time, AM was still the dominant force in radio. AM band was still the original radio band, but FM eventually overtook AM. It had stereo, it had wider bandwidth, it had greater fidelity. AM couldn't match it in terms of fidelity until AM stereo came along, but that's a whole other subject.
Now, you've had an interesting opportunity to be around, as you indicated, some legendary Nebraska broadcasters, several of whom are in the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. So this is one of those probably unfair questions to pull up a small or quick memory about various people. So let's start out with Ray Lockhart.
Ray Lockhart was an individual, did things his own way, great sales guy, understood radio sales as well as anybody, knew how to market his radio stations, became very successful, and ran very, very good radio stations. And Ray also understood technology. He believed in nothing but the best in terms of technical facilities. Even in Ogallala, Nebraska, he had nothing but the best equipment and the best signal, the most expensive transmitters, the tallest towers. Ray was a broadcaster clear through his entire being.
Joe DiNatale.
Joe came to Nebraska from Ohio in the late 1930s. Another amazing personality. Anybody that knew Joe didn't know anybody else like Joe. He was a part of 1938, 1940, 1941, early days of the radio station in North Platte. And then when the station was purchased in 1943 by WOW, was instrumental and became station manager around that time, and was instrumental in what was then network programming. It became an NBC Radio Network affiliate, and some of the programming actually originated in North Platte and was fed to the network. There was a lot of network switching done in North Platte when the programming would come from New York through Chicago, through Omaha, and then North Platte would switch commercials to go west to Denver and the West Coast. A lot of that network switching was done in North Platte, and Joe was instrumental in making that happen. Joe was a sports freak, and for many, many years was the PA voice of the state track meet here in Omaha for many years. It sounds like a cliche, but Joe forgot more about broadcasting than anybody will ever remember.
John Mitchell.
John Mitchell was probably the greatest teacher I've ever encountered. You learned a lot just being around John. He had his own way of doing things. Most of these guys, I guess the common thread is they were their own people and had their own way of doing things. John Mitchell is one of those fellows that if he asked you a question, and many times in meetings, he would drill in and ask a question about something, he already knew the answer. He was really teaching you how to act in that situation. Very creative broadcaster, very successful broadcaster, built some incredible stations. One thing about John is he surrounded himself with incredibly creative and talented people, always. And you can't talk about John without his wife, Mary. Mary was an integral part of the Mitchell Broadcasting stations, and they ran it like a family, and they treated us like family. And there was a warmth and a camaraderie among the people at Mitchell Broadcasting. Even today when we get together, we all mention the fact that it was a unique experience, a unique group of people that was never duplicated.
How did radio in Omaha change during the 23 years you were active?
Consolidation, probably the number one thing. I think when I came to Omaha, there may have been as many as 9 individual radio owners. Today, there are essentially 4 owners that own everything. That consolidation has resulted in fewer career opportunities, a lot more voice tracking, a lot more homogeneous programming, not as much original programming. And of course, the digital side of it, the new things that are coming out today with digital audio and online broadcasting. The question, what is the fate of AM radio in this digital environment? Yet to be seen.
What else would you like to talk about that we haven't covered, Neil?
Well, we built a pretty successful AM sports radio station in Omaha as an expanded band facility on 1620, and became pretty successful using graduates from the broadcast program at UNL, actually. The one guy that really stands out, and the one guy I like to refer to as the star that we actually built in Omaha, We didn't, he did it himself. But Kevin Coogler, who started out literally on KRNU and doing play-by-play freelance at KAWL in New York back in the day, today is the national network radio voice of Sunday night NFL football, of the Masters golf tournament, of the NCAA basketball championship tournament, and also does a lot of boxing on True TV. Guy never stops working, but extremely successful and one of the more recent nationally successful Nebraska broadcasters.
Anything else that you would like to include in the conversation?
I guess the question I have is, where is it going? We do a lot of guest speaking at college campuses to broadcasters of the future, to journalists of the future. And one of the things we try to impress upon them is they are the ones who are going to be writing the rules going forward. We all grew up in an industry that we think we understood. We don't anymore. The rules have all changed. And going forward, these kids that are in school today, and I call them kids, they're really not, they're way smarter and better educated than we ever were. And going forward, they're the ones that are going to determine what this business becomes and how it is used for good, or maybe not so good. But it's up to them, and I think the opportunities right now today are as good as or better than they've ever been in what we now call mass communications. We used to call it broadcasting. There's an awful lot of opportunity out there, totally blank slate, wide open horizons, and it's a real exciting time to be in the media.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil Nelkin. We've been talking with Neil Nelkin on May 14th, 2015 as part of the Nebraska Broadcasting History Project.